Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. We have Ross and James, two more wielders of the Legacy from our Patreon Discord, joining us for tonight's game. For more information on the Legacy Weapon Quest, check out our explanation in our other gameplay video linked below. If you enjoy our videos, please subscribe to our channel. It only takes a second, costs nothing to do, and goes such a long way in helping us out in the process. If you'd like to help financially, consider signing up to our Patreon, buying some merchandise, or purchasing from the TCG Player links in the description below. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have James piloting Alela, Artful Provocateur. This deck is a Stax deck that seeks to resolve more and more Stax pieces while leveraging Alela's ability to put pressure on opponents. James's opening hand contains an Urza's Saga, Flooded Strand, Esper Sentinel, Mana Crypt, Archon of Emeria, Demonic Tutor, and a Sea of Clouds. Next, we have Cal piloting Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. This deck is a control deck that looks to keep opponents in check while accruing advantage before closing out the game with a combo. Cal's opening hand contains a Soul Ring, Careful Study, Spell Pierce, Utopia Sprawl, Hinterland Harbor, and his London Mulligans are a Nexus of Fate and an Into the Royal. After that, we have Mike piloting the 4-color pairing of Kraum Ludovic's Opus and Ikra Shadiki the Usurper. This deck seeks to land advantage engines before resolving a massive game-ending spell like Ad Nauseam or Bolas the Citadel. Mike's opening hand contains a Forbidden Orchard, Mana Crypt, Rhystic Study, Demonic Tutor, Winds of Rebuke, and his London Mulligans are a Force of Will and a Demonic Consultation. Finally, we have Ross piloting Dragon Lord Dromoka. This deck looks to accelerate and land really big creatures to overwhelm the table and close out the game. Ross's opening hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Giver of Runes, Arcane Signet, Aven Mindcensor, Chrome Mox, and 2 Forests. Without further ado, let's begin this hallowed hard-nosed harrowing huddle. James wins the Chaos Orb flip and gets to start us off. James draws a card per turn and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts an Archon of Emeria. This changes the game plan of the entire table immediately, and James passes the turn. Cal draws a card per turn and plays an island. He casts a Soul Ring. Cal passes. Mike draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard into play tapped through Archon. He casts a Mana Crypt. Mike ends his turn. Ross draws and plays a Plains. He casts Esper Sentinel. Everyone groans at how the game is already starting to play out, and Ross gives the turn to James. During his upkeep, James wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Urza's Saga, getting its first counter. He casts an Esper Sentinel of his own. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with his Archon. Mike takes it, and James passes. Cal draws and plays a Hinterland Harbor into play tapped. He casts Careful Study. Both Esper Sentinels trigger, and Cal pays for them both. He draws 2, discards 2, and passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Cal a Spirit, and casts Rhystic Study. Both Sentinels trigger, and Ross and James draw. Study resolves, and Mike passes. Ross draws and plays a Forest. He casts Gadok Teague. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with his Esper Sentinel. Mike takes it, and Ross passes. During his upkeep, James loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza's Saga gets another counter. He plays a Tundra for turn. He casts a Demonic Tutor. Both Rhystics and Sentinel trigger, and James pays for all of them. He fetches up a card into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with his Archon. Mike takes it, and James ends his turn. Cal draws and plays an island. He casts his commander, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. Rhystic triggers, and Cal pays. Rashmi resolves, and Cal passes. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Cal a Spirit to cast his own Demonic Tutor. Both Sentinels trigger, Mike pays for James's, and Ross draws. Mike fetches up a card into his hand. He plays a City of Brass into play tapped and shifts the turn to Ross. Ross draws and plays a Plains. He casts Skyclave Apparition. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. It resolves, and Ross exiles Archon of Emeria. Now freed up, Ross casts a Chrome Mox. Rhystic and Esper Sentinel trigger, and Mike and James both draw. Chrome Mox enters, and Ross imprints Aven Mindcensor. He casts a Giver of Runes. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Esper Sentinel and James with Gadok Teague. They both take it, and Ross passes the turn. At the end of Ross's turn, James casts Enlightened Tutor. Rhystic and Sentinel trigger, and Ross and Mike draw. He fetches up an Arcane Laboratory onto the top of his library. The turn moves to James. During his upkeep, James wins his mana crypt roll. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, James floats a mana and sacrifices it. He fetches up a Mox Opal onto the battlefield. He plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He casts his commander, Alela, Artful Provocateur. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. He casts Arcane Laboratory. Rhystic and Esper trigger and Ross and Mike draw. Alela triggers and James creates a fairy. Laboratory resolves and James moves to combat. He attacks Mike with his Esper Sentinel. Mike takes it and James gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and casts his own Rhystic Study. Rhystic and both Sentinels trigger. Cal pays for both Sentinels and Mike draws a card. Rashmi triggers and Cal reveals a mental misstep into his hand. Rhystic Study resolves, everyone's advantage engines are now on the board, and Cal passes the turn. During his upkeep, Mike loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Marsh Flats for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Pyroblast, targeting Arcane Laboratory. Cal's Rhystic and 2 Sentinels trigger. Mike pays for none of them, and they all draw. In response, Cal pays 2 life and casts Mental Misstep, targeting Pyroblast. Cal's Rhystic and both Sentinels trigger, and they all draw a card. Cal's Rashmi triggers, and Cal reveals a Bark Channel Pathway into his hand. Pyroblast is countered, and Mike passes, discarding to hand size. Ross draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts Cultivate. Both Rhystics and Sentinel trigger, Ross pays for James and Cal, and then Mike draws. Cultivate resolves, and Ross fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield and a forest into his hand. He activates Giver of Runes, giving Gaddock Teeg protection from black. He moves to combat and attacks James with Gaddock Teeg. James takes it, and Ross passes the turn. During his upkeep, James loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Cursed Totem. Both Rhystics and Sentinel trigger, and James pays for all of them. Alela triggers, and James creates a fairy. He attacks Ross with Alela and Mike with Esper Sentinel. Ross and Mike take it, and James gains 2 life. James passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Tide Channel Pathway. He casts a Mystic Remora. Both Sentinels and Rhystic trigger, and Cal pays for all of them. Rashmi triggers, and Cal reveals a Polluted Delta into his hand. In response, Mike taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Ross a Spirit to cast Winds of Rebuke, targeting Arcane Laboratory. Rhystic and Sentinels trigger, Mike pays for Cal and James, and Ross draws a card. Winds of Rebuke bounces Arcane Laboratory, and each player mills 2. Then Remora resolves. Now freed up from under the laboratory, Cal casts Chrome Mox, paying the Rhystic tax. It enters, and Cal imprints Abundant Harvest. Cal passes the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays an Underground Sea for turn. He casts Rite of Flame. Both Sentinels, Rhystic, and Remora all trigger. Mike pays for none of them, and they all draw. Quick note, that was 4 cards drawn from a Rite of Flame. Mike adds 2 red. Mike casts Yawgmoth's Will. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Cal draws 2. Will resolves, exiles, and Mike taps his City of Brass to cast Demonic Tutor from his graveyard. He fetches up a card into his hand. He taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Ross a Spirit to cast Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers, and Cal draws. It resolves, and Mike creates 10 treasures. He casts Phantasmal Image, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, James casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Dockside. Cal's Rhystic and Mystic, Mike's Rhystic, and Ross's Esper Sentinel all trigger, and they all draw. In response, Mike casts Winds of Rebuke from his graveyard, targeting his own Dockside. In response, Cal casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Winds of Rebuke. Rhystic and both Sentinels trigger, Cal pays for Mike's Rhystic, and James and Ross draw off of Sentinel. Rashmi triggers, and Cal reveals a Mox Diamond into his hand, choosing not to cast it to keep Mike off of additional Rhystic draws. Then Flusterstorm counters Winds of Rebuke. With swords still on the stack, Mike casts Deflecting Swat from his graveyard, targeting Swords to Plowshares. Cal's Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and in response, Ross casts Noxious Revival, targeting Swansong in James's graveyard to help the situation. Both Rhystics, Mystic, and Esper Sentinel all trigger, and they all draw. In response, Cal casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Deflecting Swat. Mike's Rhystic triggers, and he draws. In response, Mike casts Pyroblast from his graveyard, targeting Force of Negation. Pyroblast counters Force of Negation, Noxious Revival puts Swansong onto the top of James's library, Cal draws from Mystic and Rhystic, Deflecting Swat redirects Swords of Plowshares to Rashmi, Rashmi is exiled, and Cal gains 2, and Phantasmal Image finally resolves. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, and Mike creates 10 more treasures. Mike casts Counterbalance from his graveyard. He casts Deathrite Shaman from his graveyard, paying the Rhystic tax. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Kraum. Cal takes it, and Mike finally ends his turn, with Cal now having 13 cards in hand. Ross draws and plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Counterbalance triggers, and Mike reveals an Assassin's Trophy. 2 Ristics, a Mystic, and Sentinel all trigger, and everyone draws. Ross casts his commander, Dragonlord Dromoka. Kraum and 2 Ristics trigger, and Mike and Cal draw. Ross casts an Arcane Signet. Both Ristics and Mystic trigger, and Mike and Cal draw again. Ross casts 3 Visits. Mike draws from Ristic, and Cal draws 2 from Ristic and Mystic. Ross fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts a Draneth Magistrate. Both Ristics trigger, and Mike and Cal draw. With nothing else, Ross passes. During his upkeep, James wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Vault of Champions. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Alela, Cal's Ristic and Mystic, Mike's Ristic and Counterbalance, and Ross's Esper Sentinel all trigger. Ross draws, Counterbalance reveals a Mana Vault, Sensei's Top is countered, Mike draws through Ristic, Cal draws 2 cards, and then James creates a Fairy. James casts Aven Mind Sensor. Ristic Studies trigger, and Mike and Cal draw. Kraum triggers, and Mike draws again. Counterbalance triggers, and Mike reveals a Cabal Ritual. James recasts his Arcane Laboratory. Alela, Ristic, and Mystic, Ristic, and Counterbalance all trigger. Counterbalance reveals an Arcane Signet, then Mike and Cal draw, then James creates a Fairy. Then Arcane Laboratory resolves. James moves to combat and attacks Mike with Alela and 2 Fairies. Mike takes it all, and James gains 2. James ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cal pays to keep its Remora. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault. Both Espers and Ristic trigger, and Cal pays for all of them. Counterbalance triggers, and Mike reveals a Jessica's Will. Mana Vault resolves, and with 25 cards in hand, Cal passes the turn, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Command Tower. Locked out of doing anything meaningful because of Arcane Laboratory, he passes as well, discarding to hand size. Ross draws and plays a Horizon Canopy. He sacrifices it and draws a card. He casts Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite, paying for both Ristics. With everyone locked out due to Dromoka's ability, Elesh Norn resolves, wiping out a good portion of the board. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with everything. Cal takes all of it, and Ross gains 7 through Dromoka. Ross passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, James loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, does nothing, and passes. At the end of James's turn, Cal casts Frantic Search. Ristic and Sentinels trigger, and Cal pays. Counterbalance triggers, and Mike reveals a Dothy Voidwalker. Then Cal draws 2, discards 2, and untaps 3 lands. Then James discards to hand size. During his upkeep, Cal lets his Remora die. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He casts a Wavebreak Hippocamp. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, James casts Demonic Consultation. Both Ristics and Sentinel trigger, and they all draw. Counterbalance triggers, and James asks Mike not to trigger it, because he's looking for a Cyclonic Rift to help with the board state, and to not lose to Ross's army. Mike declines, and James asks that everyone in the comments come after Mike for his treachery. Then Mike reveals a Flusterstorm off of Counterbalance, countering Consultation. This is also when everyone realizes that Wavebreak Hippocamp is a 2/2 and dies immediately to Elesh Norn. Wavebreak dies, and still in the instep, Mike casts Assassin's Trophy, targeting Arcane Laboratory, paying for Ristic and Sentinel. It resolves, Laboratory is destroyed, James fetches up a Snow-Covered Plains, and then the turn moves to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Imperial Seal. Sentinel and Ristic trigger, Mike pays for Sentinel, and Cal draws. In response, James casts Swan Song, targeting Seal. Counterbalance triggers, and Mike reveals an Arid Mesa. Ristics and Sentinel trigger, and James pays for all 3. Swan Song counters Imp Seal, Mike creates a 2/2 bird, and then it immediately dies to Elesh Norn. Next, Mike casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Ross, paying the Ristic tax. In response, Cal casts Negate, paying the Ristic tax, and letting Ross draw through Sentinel. In response, Mike casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Negate. Ristic triggers, and Cal draws. Flusterstorm counters Negate, and Jessica's Will resolves. Mike adds 10 red and exiles Arid Mesa, Demonic Consultation, and a Crop Rotation. Mike casts Demonic Consultation from exile. Ristic triggers, and Mike pays. It resolves, and Mike names Underworld Breach. He exiles the top 6, and then begins to exile. And exile. And exile until he finally finds Underworld Breach and puts it into his hand. Mike looks at the cards he exiled and realizes he nearly exiled every single one of his win cons, so he's in a really tough spot. This is also when the table realizes that Mike should not have been able to cast Demonic Consultation due to Drannith Magistrate. The team agrees that, while this is a competitive EDH game, we're all still here to have some fun, and so they agree to let this particular one slide. They also partially agree because he's exiled most of his win cons. Mike casts Underworld Breach. He moves to combat, letting his mana fade, and attacks Cal with Kraum. Cal takes it and dies. In his second main phase, Mike taps his City of Brass to cast Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 7 life as an additional cost. All creatures get -7/-7, the board is wiped, Skyclave Apparition triggers, and James creates a 3/3 illusion. Mike plays a Volcanic Island for turn. Now freed up from under Drannith, he escapes Dockside Extortionist from his graveyard. It enters and Mike creates 5 treasures. He casts Crop Rotation from exile, sacrificing Underground Sea and fetching up a Misty Rainforest onto the battlefield. He cracks it and pays a life and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield and only has 4 cards left in his library. Mike escapes Jessica's Will, targeting Ross, adding 10 red. He casts Brain Freeze with a storm count of 13, with all copies targeting Ross, milling him for 39. He escapes Brain Freeze from his graveyard once again, with all copies targeting Ross, milling him for 42. He escapes Manamorphose from his graveyard, adding 2 blue and drawing a card. He escapes Brain Freeze again, with all copies at James this time, with a storm count of 16, milling James for 48. He escapes Brain Freeze again, targeting James. The first copy resolves, and James mills Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, shuffling his graveyard into his library, and Mike now has a serious problem. Then James mills the rest through the copies of Brain Freeze. Mike escapes Manamorphose from his graveyard, adding 2 black. He casts Stealthy Voidwalker. He now casts Brain Freeze again, with a storm count of 20. Now James mills, but they all mill into exile this time, preventing the Shuffle Titan trigger. James mills the rest of his library into exile. Mike escapes Lotus Petal from his graveyard. He escapes Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dauthi Voidwalker. Finally finished up, Mike passes the turn, sacrificing Underworld Breach. Ross attempts to draw from an empty library and loses the game. During his upkeep, James loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. Still in his upkeep, James casts Angel's Grace. Counterbalance triggers, which does dodge split second, and Mike reveals a Jeweled Lotus. Angel's Grace resolves, and James moves to draw. He attempts to draw from an empty library, but doesn't lose the game due to Angel's Grace. He casts Karn, the Great Creator. He activates Karn's ability, putting Sword of Feast and Famine from exile into his hand. He casts Sword of Feast and Famine. He equips it onto his illusion and passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. Mike passes back to James. James attempts to draw from an empty library and loses the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what an incredible game. Congrats to Mike on his win. He had his fair share of setbacks throughout this game. He was able to fight through them though and pull out a victory against all odds. There were some misplays throughout the game from all players, but that's okay. Everyone had a ton of fun, and that's what EDH is all about at the end of the day. At all power levels, we are here to have a good time. The most valuable card in tonight's game was very tough to decide. At first, we thought it should go to Dauthi Voidwalker, giving Mike the chance he needed to fight through the Shuffle Titan, preventing him from winning. We then thought it should go to Aristic Study or Esper Sentinel, drawing so many cards in this game. We also thought about Gadok Teague, because while it may not have been as obvious in tonight's game, it was shutting off a lot of people's game plans. At the end of the day, we had to give the most valuable card to Arcane Laboratory. It didn't matter what side of the table you were on, this card was completely hosing all strategies at the table. Counter wars became near impossible, board states were very difficult to push forward, and it caused players to discard a combined 25 cards over one rotation. This was because they couldn't play what they had in their hand. This includes Cal's 18 card discard and Mike's 6 card discard as well. This card proved to be a complete prison to the decks at the table. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time and we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Alright, Patreon shout out time. I'd like to give a shout out to Cameron James, Ricky Undercuff Fleur, Justice for Dak, Gabriel Adams, Thomas Thurber, Katarina, Noah Queerswell, Nod Noodle, Nicholas Tatum, Anton Oberg, Tom Spackman, Ryan Wright, Otto Von Trapp, Ivan, Connor Holtz, Nathan Smith, Willow Lysander, Pyro, Dark, Philip Hickey, Jacob Cromer, Brad Tobin, Matt Wingrove, Delph Driz, Chad Hendricks, Dante, Christian L. Sutphin, Ryan Brower, Rune, Rikeko, Michael Hallett, Paul M. Toll, Quick Draw, Zods, Covey Smith, James Cody Halley, Spielrahu, CZ, Taylor Coron, Darius Mitchell, King O'Sharks, Liam, Caleb Pretty, Tauntaun 101, Jacob Simpson, and Thomas Bowers. Thank you all very much.